here to celebrate the Tractatus. However, I have to start by saying that I can really only do it from afar. Both in that my understanding of the Tractatus is not the fruit of in-depth exploration, and in that this understanding is informed by Wittgenstein's last work, the first that fell into my hands, On Certainty. I have never felt the pull of the Tractatus in the way I have felt the pull of Wittgenstein's later works. This is because from my admittedly unhoned reading of it and from my reading others on it, I have never found it to be as groundbreaking, as paradigm shifting as the investigations and On Certainty. What I understand and admire of the Tractatus is the Tractatus that sows the seeds of what's to come. So in this talk, I won't say much about the Tractatus other than what I take to be some of those seeds. So I would say that one of the continuous tracks of Wittgenstein's philosophy is the discernment and elucidation of grammar, its nature and its limits. What I will try to do now is briefly trace Wittgenstein's evolving notion of grammar from the Tractatus to On Certainty. I will then distinguish in Wittgenstein what I will call a thin grammar, a grammar that governs our use of words independently of facts about the world, from a thick grammar, a grammar that is reality-soaked or fact-dependent. It seems to me that Wittgenstein's thick grammar grows increasingly thick, so much so that there occurs in the third Wittgenstein, the post-investigations Wittgenstein, what I call a grammaticalization of experience. So the limits of what makes sense and what does not, what can be said and what cannot, is a leitmotif of Wittgenstein's philosophy. But what determines those limits? The late Wittgenstein's astonishing answer is grammar. For him, language, any language, is rule-governed, that is, governed by rules of grammar. However, what Wittgenstein means by grammar is both similar to and different from what we usually mean by grammar. Ray Monk recounts the following due to Rush Rees. Moore, who attended Wittgenstein's lectures, insisted that Wittgenstein was using the word grammar in a rather odd sense. Thus, he argued the sentence "3 men was working" is incontrovertibly a misuse of grammar, but it is not clear that different colors cannot be in the same place in a visual field at the same time commits a similar transgression. If this latter is also called a misuse of grammar, then grammar must mean something different in each case. No, replied Wittgenstein. The right expression is, it does not have sense to say. Both kinds of rules were rules in the same sense. It is just that some have been the subject of philosophical discussion and some have not. And what Monk importantly adds here is that grammatical mistakes made by philosophers are more pernicious than ordinary grammatical mistakes. Wittgenstein then expands our ordinary understanding of grammar rather than altering it. For him, grammar is not merely comprised of syntactical rules, but of all the conditions for making sense. Such conditions include anything that is a preparation for a description. And so straightforward definitions or expressions of rules used to explain the use of certain symbols, prescriptions and proscriptions, conceptual elucidations, such as reminders of the kinds of statements we are making. In On Certainty, Wittgenstein goes as far as to take our basic certainties, because they underpin our making sense, to be rules of grammar. For if grammar includes all the requirements for sense, it must then also include basic certainties, such as there exist people other than myself. For isn't that a requisite underpinning of sense, a preparation for such descriptions as there are 20 of us in this room, or Vietnam's population is 96.5 million. Moreover, following Wittgenstein's criterion for the misuse of grammar in his reply to Moore above, it does not have sense to say, it has at least as little sense to say no one exists but me as to say 3 men was working. In fact, people are more likely not to understand what you are saying in the first case than in the second. In both cases, they'll understand all the words, But as Monk noted, violations of grammar can be more or less pernicious. So that whereas 3 men was working is hardly noticeable, no one exists but me, intended literally, smacks of the pathological. We'll come back to this. I'll now briefly outline the early Wittgenstein's drawing of the limits of language as it relates to nonsense and ineffability. In On Heidegger on Being and Dread, written in 29, Wittgenstein writes, "Man feels the urge to run up against the limits of language. Think, for example, of the astonishment that anything at all exists. This astonishment cannot be expressed in the form of a question, and there is also no answer whatsoever. Anything we might say is a priori bound to be nonsense." Why is anything we might say an explanation of the astonishment that anything at all exists nonsense? In his lecture on ethics, written in the same year, Wittgenstein writes, "I see now that these nonsensical expressions were not nonsensical because I had not yet found the correct expressions, but that their nonsensicality was their very essence. Ethics, so far as it springs from the desire to say something about the ultimate meaning of life, the absolute good, the absolute valuable, can be no science. What it says does not add to our knowledge in any sense." So at this early period of his thought, Wittgenstein viewed as technically nonsensical, or in some cases senseless, any expression that did not add to our knowledge, that was not a proposition of natural science. This includes the expressions of ethics and aesthetics, the mystical, and his own Tractarian sentences. None of these are truth-conditional propositions, and so cannot add to our knowledge. It is their not adding to knowledge that makes Tractarian Sätze technically nonsensical. But it does not make them gibberish. For though Tractarian remarks do not inform, they elucidate, 6.54, which is the rightful task of philosophy, 4.112. Indeed, the fact that Wittgenstein calls his own Tractarian remarks nonsensical should alert us to there being a non-derogatory, indeed a positive understanding of the nonsensical in the Tractatus. Already the first sentence in the Lecture on Ethics passage shows Wittgenstein alluding to different uses of nonsense, but he was to make this clearer. In the Ambrose Lectures, 1932 to 35, he says, "The word nonsense is used to exclude certain things for different reasons. By the time of the investigations, he uses the term nonsense, senseless, has no sense, indiscriminately, to refer to combinations of words that are excluded from the language, withdrawn from circulation, PI 500, and insists that this exclusion may be for different reasons." But the Tractatus out of thought was clear enough in its distinctions of different kinds of nonsense. There is nonsense that results from a violation of sense, say when categorical boundaries are misread and allowed to overlap, as in the question, is the good more or less identical than the beautiful? Or in 2 + 2 at 3 o'clock = 4. There is also nonsense, call it important nonsense, that does not make sense either because it is impossible to put into words, for instance, the mystical, ethics, and aesthetics, or because it enables or regulates sense. For example, there is only one, or because it elucidates or logically clarifies thought. For example, Tractarian remarks. It seems to me that regulatory and elucidatory nonsense are precursors of what Wittgenstein will later call grammar. Moreover, inasmuch as the Tractarian Wittgenstein takes only truth-conditional utterances to be sayable, any string of words that does not express a truth-conditional proposition is not, technically speaking, sayable. On that count, all nonsense is ineffable. However, as regards important nonsense, whereas the mystical, ethics, and aesthetics cannot even be put into words, regulative and elucidatory nonsense, though not sayable strictly speaking, can be meaningfully formulated for heuristic purposes. That is, they can be formulated to serve as steps towards a clearer understanding of the conditions of sense or limit to thought. Tractarian remarks must be passed over in silence, in that they are not truth-conditional propositions, but the steps or ladder to intelligibility or perspicuity. Once used, the ladder must be thrown away. For these heuristic aids do not belong to the sphere of language, but to its delimitation. That is, they belong to what Wittgenstein will later call the scaffolding of thought, on Certainty 211. In the Moore lectures, he makes clear that nonsense is produced by trying to express, by the use of language, what ought to be embodied in the grammar. And here, I can't help quoting von Richt, though it's a long quote. In the preface to the Tractatus, Wittgenstein said, "The book will therefore draw a limit to thinking, or rather not to thinking, but to the expression of thoughts. For in order to draw a limit to thinking, we should have to be able to think what cannot be thought." Very much the same thing he could have said in a preface, had he ever written one, to his last writings, those published under the title On Certainty. Beyond everything we know or conjecture or think of as true, there is a foundation of accepted truth without which there would be no such thing as knowing or conjecturing or thinking things true. But to think of the things whereof this foundation is made as known to us or as true is to place them among the things which stand on this very foundation, is to view the receptacle as another object within. This clearly cannot be done. If the foundation is what we have to accept before we say of anything that it is known or true, then it cannot itself be known or true. What Moore called common sense is very much the same thing as that which Wittgenstein in the Tractatus would have referred to as the limits of the world. Wittgenstein's high appreciation of Moore's article must partly have stemmed from the fact he recognized in Moore's efforts a strong similarity with his own. And his criticism of Moore and uncertainty we could, in the language of the Tractatus, characterize as a criticism of an attempt to say the unsayable. Now, the later Wittgenstein will extend the list of the sayable to include non-truth conditional uses of language, such as spontaneous utterances, questions, imperatives. But he will never give up the idea that some things cannot be said in the sphere of language, that is, in the flow of the language game, or the idea that some things cannot be put into words at all, but can show themselves through words, and he will add through deeds. In fact, he will add certainties to the list of the ineffable, the grammatical ineffable. Like regulative nonsense, certainties cannot be said because they constitute the scaffolding of sense, not its object. Basic certainties, so for example, there exist people other than myself, I have a body, human beings are mortal, need nourishment, are removed from the traffic, OC 210. They cannot meaningfully be said in the flow of the language game as if they were open for discussion because they are bounds of sense, rules of grammar, not objects of sense. To give an example, to say to the cloakroom attendant upon handing him my token, "This is a token," is to arrest the flow of the language game. This is a token is one of the rules of grammar which must remain ineffable for the language game to be played. That is, I hand the cloakroom attendant my token and he fetches my coat. Now, I think then that the Tractatus sets the stage for what Wittgenstein will later call grammar. Grammar is that which enables or regulates sense, and so is itself nonsensical, without sense, and cannot meaningfully be said in the flow of the language game, but only heuristically articulated. In the Tractatus, Wittgenstein writes of all men are mortal, that its general validity is accidental, in contrast with the essential general validity of logic. This is in 6.1231. Whereas in uncertainty, all men are mortal would be considered a grammatical or logical rule, a bound of sense. This, it seems to me, is because the Tractarian Wittgenstein does not yet see that logic is reality-soaked, rather than reality being logic-soaked, and language grasping reality via isomorphism. Only the later Wittgenstein realizes that it is our grammar that structures reality, a reality which lies, as he puts it in PI, beyond the notation. The connection between language and reality has long perplexed philosophers. Is human language the result of our attempts to translate nature's own language? But how can nature have a language? More plausibly, is human language the result of our attempts to facilitate and enhance our relationship with nature and each other? The connection between language and reality is made by definitions of words, and these belong to grammar, writes Wittgenstein. Where the Tractarian Wittgenstein thought that the logical form of the world shows itself, say in the form of contingent propositions, the later Wittgenstein realizes that there is no such thing in the world or nature as a logical form, an outline, a system, or a concept. The system does not reside in the nature of things, Settle 357. Nature is conceptually unmarked. It is we who with our language cut paths or inroads of salience and understanding in order to harness the contingent in ways that produce and govern sense for us. For Wittgenstein, this tracing is not metaphysical, but grammatical. One thinks that one is tracing the outline of a thing's nature over and over again, and one is merely tracing round the frame through which we look at it. So at the conceptual basis of our confrontation with experience are not bare particulars, but grammar. It is grammar that tells us what kind of object anything is. So that as linguistic beings, we come to experience and grapple the world always already with language. And there is no getting out of language to compare or measure our outline against bare particulars. This, however, does not make Wittgenstein a linguistic idealist. He does not reduce reality, the world, or even our world to language. Though we are responsible for its conceptual outline, the world is not our invention. Wittgenstein is clear that grammar is not, in fact, cannot be accountable to reality. Grammatical conventions cannot be justified by describing what is represented. Any such description already presupposes the grammatical rules. But he is also increasingly aware that reality impacts our grammar or concepts. The rule we lay down is the one most strongly suggested by the facts of experience. Though we don't read off our concepts from nature, our concepts are impacted by natural facts which are fundamental or salient for us. What we have to mention in order to explain the significance, the importance of a concept, are often extremely general facts of nature, such facts as are hardly ever mentioned because of their great generality. But what is the nature of this correspondence? Would it be correct to say our concepts reflect our life, he asks, to which he replies, they stand in the middle of it. This means that our concepts are immersed in our life, intertwined with it in a dynamic interaction. The fabric of life provides the milieu in which our concepts are formed. In turn, our concepts order the fabric of life. Does this mean that the grammar of our language is justified by facts? The post-Tractarian Wittgenstein asks himself this question again and again, from at least 1930. You'll recognize his late formulation of it, 1946-47, which I don't have time to read. His answer is that of course we're interested in the correspondence between our grammar and very general facts of nature, but not in the way natural scientists or historians are. That is, we're not interested in any empirical justification or historical account for having the grammatical rules we do. Let me give an example. There are cases where a rule of grammar may have its historical root in an empirical discovery. For example, the realization that men have something to do with the reproductive process. It was long thought that women singly procreated. May well be at the root of the grammatical rule, every human being has parents. OC 211, he mentions that. However, such anthropological justification is of no interest to philosophers. What they are interested in is what logically demarcates sense from nonsense, and that cannot be due to justification. The essence of logical possibility is what is laid down in language. What is laid down depends on facts, but is not made true or false by them. Our grammatical rules are not the result of reasoning or justification. So how are facts connected to grammar? In contrast to what I call a thin grammar, a grammar whose rules are not conditioned by facts, but are normatively engendered and sanctioned. For example, 2 + 2 = 4, a rod has a length. This is what we call a table. The rules of what I call thick grammar are rooted in facts and may be experientially or normatively engendered and sanctioned. Examples of thick grammatical rules are: there exist people other than myself, human beings have bodies, need nourishment, human beings can go to the moon. In Uncertainty, Wittgenstein explicitly opposes the terms cause and ground to distinguish a non-ratiocinated rootedness in facts and experience from a ratiocinated one. Would it be right to say that my having a body is a bound of sense for me because previous experience has taught me so? No. Our lifelong experience of having a body may be the cause of it being a bound of sense, but it is not its ground. I have not come to the conclusion that I have a body by, quote, following a particular line of thought, OC 103. Our experience of having a body or of mountains not sprouting up in an hour is not empirical. It is either instinctive, as is the case of having a body, or acquired via repeated exposure or conditioning, and so second nature, as is the case with mountains being there immemorially. It may help here to distinguish between experiential, embedded in experience, and empirical, inferred from experience. Our lifelong experience of ourselves as embodied, or of the world as populated by people other than ourselves, is part of the scaffolding of sense for us. These facts are fused into the foundation of our language game. They are part of the substratum of all our inquiring and asserting. That is part of our grammar. And where some thick rules of grammar may have started life as news-breaking propositions, for example, human beings can go to the moon, it is only with time and repetition, once they have hardened into a rule, that they belong to the scaffolding of our thoughts. Among these very general facts of nature which condition our concepts, we find what Wittgenstein calls the common behavior of mankind. This includes our shared natural reactions, reactions such as crying when in pain or sad, smiling when glad, jumping when startled, gasping or screaming when afraid, reacting to someone's suffering. He calls those instinctive common reactions or action patterns prototypes of thought, in Remarks on the Philosophy of Psychology 1. These are the necessary starting points of language. It is characteristic of our, it doesn't matter. It is characteristic of our language that the foundation on which it grows consists of steady ways of living, regular ways of acting. Without certain constantly recurring patterns, our concepts would have no grip. So that our acquiring concepts such as pain, okay, sorry about that. Right. Our acquiring concepts such as pain requires that we have normal prototypical human reactions. If a child looked radiant when it was hurt and shrieked for no apparent reason, one couldn't teach him to use the word pain. In his last writings on the philosophy of psychology, Wittgenstein delves deeper into those action patterns as they typically and often internally relate to feelings and emotions. He introduces the expressions patterns of life and patterns of experience to denote the constant repetition, the regular characteristics of our various psychological expressions and behaviors. For example, those of pain, joy, grief, hope, but also of simulated pain, joy, grief, hope, and so on. Going as far as to suggest that typical physiognomies and constitutive rhythm and tempo attached to them. Patterns of life refer to recurring behavioral and facial expressions characteristic of psychological concept. There is not only one or even a handful of occasions that we might call grief, but innumerable ones that are interwoven with 1,000 other patterns. And this is so for all our psychological concepts. However, this psychological indeterminacy is everywhere bounded by certain regularities. An order or pattern emerges from obstinate, though constantly varied, repetition. The point here is that though there is an indefiniteness or indeterminacy essential to the kind of repetition in question, for it is a repetition that is embedded in life, there is a repetition, a pattern, and our psychological grammar is conditioned by such patterns. So the hinged certainties of uncertainty and the patterns of life and of experience of last writings attest to the fact that the third Wittgenstein increasingly engages in what I like to call the grammaticalization of experience. Sig grammar, inasmuch as it is conditioned by our human form of life, is a grammaticalization of experience. The basic concepts are interwoven so closely with what is most fundamental in our way of living that they are therefore unassailable. The grammaticalization of experience did not come easily to Wittgenstein. As early as 1930, he writes, "I will count any fact whose obtaining is a presupposition of a proposition's making sense as belonging to language," by which he means grammar. However, in his last notes, remarks on color and uncertainty, we find him hesitant. Here it could now be asked what I really want, to what extent I want to deal with grammar. And what he'd asserted as a correspondence between concepts and very general facts in nature and PI is now put in the form of a question, albeit a rhetorical one, in uncertainty. Indeed, doesn't it seem obvious that the possibility of a language game is conditioned by certain facts? However, his inclination to believe that not everything that has the form of an empirical proposition is one wins the day. In uncertainty, he is finally reconciled with the fact that some apparently empirical propositions form the foundation of all operating with thought, with language. In fact, he could have reminded himself of this passage from the remarks on the foundations of mathematics. To accept a proposition as unshakably certain means to use it as a grammatical rule. Wittgenstein has understood that grammar can be reality-soaked without being empirical, but the journey was laborious, confirming that not empiricism and yet realism in philosophy is indeed the hardest thing. Our concepts delimit the world, but the world has its impact. Wittgenstein's realization that grammar stroke logic has an anthropological twist is crucially important for philosophy. It redefines the limits of sense or possibility. I'll just finish with a word on this. Wittgenstein's conception of the logical is internally linked to our human form of life, and this does not sit well with traditional conceptions of logical necessity. Stanley Cavell points out this apparent shortcoming. Wittgenstein's philosophy provides, one might say, an anthropological or even anthropomorphic view of necessity, and that can be disappointing, as if it is not really necessity which he has given an anthropological view of, as though if the a priori has a history, it cannot really be the a priori in question. On the standard philosophical view, the logical must encompass all possible worlds. Too many philosophers think, like Bertrand Russell, that no logical absurdity results from the hypothesis that the world consists of myself and my thoughts and feelings and sensations, and that everything else is mere fancy. This, the Tractarian Wittgenstein would have endorsed. I quote TLP 302, "A thought contains the possibility of the situation of which it is the thought. What is thinkable is possible too." But on Wittgenstein's anthropological view of logic, which would include the grammatical rule, "there exist people other than myself," logical absurdity would result from the claim that the world consists of myself alone, unless meant figuratively or embedded in a fictional context. Conceivability can be equal to possibility in fictional worlds, but in our world, possibility is dependent on the conditions of sense anchored in our human form of life. A thought that has lost its human mooring and runs wild on the uncharted tracks of the imagination is not a possibility, it's a thought. It takes anthropological bounds of sense to enable us to discern the humanly possible from the merely imaginable. So Wittgenstein had a second look at logical necessity and saw that, as Cora Diamond puts it, it has a human face. The logical limit of possibility in our form of life has to be an anthropological limit. Wittgenstein's extension of logic to incorporate specifically human bounds of sense prevents, or ought to prevent, philosophers from envisaging life-size absurdities as legitimate possibilities. Philosophical speculation should not be deemed sufficiently confined by conceivability. It must be constrained by logical parameters specific to our world. Ray Gaeta is right. We cannot purify our concepts of their embeddedness in human life without being left with only a shadow play of the grammar of serious judgment. Wittgenstein decried this purification of our concepts, or as he puts it, the crystalline purity of logic. For logic to stop being empty, he realized, it must get back to the rough ground. And that precisely is where he put it. Thank you for your attention.